The new Labour government have inherited one of the worst fiscal situations in modern history. And although they've done their best to reduce expectations, they have still made pledges which will be difficult to achieve. Not to raise taxes, improve public services, and keep debt low, the fiscal rules. It's a kind of unholy trinity, where you might be able to do two, but to do all three seems almost impossible. So which one should be sacrificed? Should it be debt limits, tax rises, or public services? I'd be interested to hear your view too, so do leave a comment. And also we'll look at whether somehow there's a way to avoid this really unpleasant trade-off between these different objectives. Well, firstly, the scale of the problem is quite daunting. Under current spending plans, spending will rise by only 1.2% per year over the next 3 years, and this is less than spending plans by any new Labour government. Given the commitment to healthcare and defence, the already left behind services like the police, criminal courts, prisons, probation, child social care will face real-term cuts in the coming years. But this is on top of a long history of waiting lists and accumulated problems. It seems that wherever we look, the government keep facing demands for more spending. Just recently, the public sector pay review body recommended 5% wage growth for public sector workers. Now, this is pretty modest given pay rises over the past 10 years. Nurses have seen real wage cuts. But a small increase in public sector wages adds an extra £7 billion to government spending, negating pretty much all the Labour Party's planned tax rises. The IFS estimate that ending the cap on child benefit would cost around £3.4 billion. But so far the government is saying the country can't afford it. Now, the Child Poverty Action Group claimed that if you did end the cap on child benefit, it could lift 250,000 children out of relative poverty. So this is an example of a trade-off. Do we reduce child poverty, or do we stick to debt limits and not increasing taxes? Now, the biggest concern at the election was the state of the NHS. Voters really care about whether they can see a doctor, get treated. But here the government faces more difficult choices. Waiting lists have reached a record 7 million and are forecast to fall only quite slowly. The problem here is that the demand for healthcare has been rising faster than government spending and the number of doctors and nurses in hospitals. It's partly due to poor health, also an ageing population. Yet, if the government could meet all its own objectives for treating patients quickly, one report claims it could benefit the economy by over £70 billion in the next 5 years. This is through people being able to return to work, the impact on family carers having more time to work themselves, and also reduced welfare benefits. Sickness benefits have increased a lot. If spending could give this kind of return, then it would justify more government borrowing because you get a pretty good rate of return on higher spending. Yet the government have limited the amount they can borrow through their own fiscal rules. Now, currently, the fiscal rules state that debt to GDP should fall in 5 years' time. It's actually one of the looser ones in recent years. But fiscal rules may sound very impressive, but I think it's fair to say they're more of a political choice than any particular set of economic wisdom set in stone. And so is it a mistake to put this weight around your neck of an arbitrary fiscal rule? Well, firstly, we've had 9 different fiscal rules in the past 30 years. Did anyone notice when fiscal rules got changed? Even with the current fiscal rule, there's always a temptation to kind of fudge the issue, because a current fiscal rule means the government can set its spending and tax plans. But the government can easily propose tax and spending plans, which we call a fiscal fiction. They have no intention of actually doing it. A good example is in the past 10-15 years, the government always forecast petrol tax would go up. But of course it never did. It always got frozen. And actually today, petrol tax is around 40% lower in real terms than it was in 2010. So the big question is, how serious is it if debt was to exceed the fiscal limit? Would we get another Liz Truss moment, which really panicked markets in 2022? Well, currently debt is 95% of GDP, around 85% if we exclude Bank of England debt. If we look at debt in a historical context, it's not particularly unusual. In fact, it's actually lower than the average of the past 250 years. Fears over debt are partly political. And just to briefly reference the Truss budget, there the crisis was more about the high inflation and the sudden rise in bond yields due to that expectation of rising interest rates. And I think the bigger picture is that in the past 15 years we've had a degree of austerity, spending cut in many departments, but this didn't stem the rise in debt. And this was partly due to external shocks like COVID, Ukraine crisis and rising energy prices. So should we worry about debt rising? For me, a key issue is, why is debt rising? If it is to fund transfer payments such as, say, higher pensions, which can do little to boost economic growth, then higher government borrowing is going to escalate over time. It can cause problems such as higher debt interest payments, which currently are taking quite a high share of government revenue. But if debt is to fund investment in healthcare, transport, energy and housing, then there's a possibility, not guaranteed, but there's a possibility that this investment can really boost economic growth and therefore lead to the higher tax revenues without increasing tax rates. And that's what everybody wants, more tax revenue without having to put up the tax rates. Now, in the post-war period, this was the UK's success. 1950, debt to GDP, nearly 240% of GDP, astronomical figure. But debt fell over the next 4 decades because of that long period of economic growth. And that's the key question. Could we return to a similar rate of economic growth we saw in the post-war period? Well, are there any alternatives to this difficult trade-off the government faces? Well, in another video, I'll look at the prospect of positive money, creating money out of nothing, but we'll leave that for another time. What about increasing taxes? Now, the government have pretty much ruled out income tax, national insurance, corporation tax and VAT. It doesn't leave much else. Now, they could gain a couple of billion by charging interest on bank reserves held at the Bank of England like the ECB do, but nothing like the £40 billion suggested by the Reform Party at the last election. Other proposed taxes include changes to non-dom status, VAT on private school fees, and an additional windfall tax on North Sea oil. All these taxes will raise an estimated £8 billion, but that's almost a drop in the ocean when you consider NHS spending is getting close to £200 billion and the public sector pay review wanted an extra £7 billion just for wages. Now, other new revenue could include changes to tax on inheritance, the Labour promising to close the tax gap, reduce tax evasion, but they claim will save an extra £5 billion. But it's one of those things, you believe it when you actually see it. The bottom line, though, is that there's no major game changer. You can get a few billion here and there, but there's no great pot of money unless you want to use corporation tax, income tax and VAT. Probably the biggest thing that will get more tax revenue is a continuation of a policy to freeze income tax bands. That means with inflation and rising wages, more taxpayers will fall into higher tax bands. But also we have to remember that even as a government might get some extra revenue from some sources, they'll also be losing revenue from declines in other tax revenue. There's going to be a decline in petrol use because of electric cars, a decline in smoking rates, a decline in alcohol consumption, and also a decline in North Sea oil production in the coming years. Not really government policy, just because there's no really oil left. So all this is going to reduce government revenues at a time when they're wanting more. The one real alternative to avoiding these hard choices is somehow to boost productivity in the public sector. The past 10-15 years it's been particularly bad, especially in the NHS. Certainly under the COVID years, which were of course very difficult, there was a dramatic decline in healthcare productivity. So extra money has not necessarily led to better health outcomes. Now, measuring productivity in the healthcare sector is not an easy thing because, of course, you can increase productivity by reducing the quality of care. And if you look at quality adjusted productivity, that's done slightly better than raw productivity. The other alternative, of course, is for the government to just get lucky. Sometimes governments do get lucky through higher global economic growth, a boost to global productivity. Now, the government may claim that their policies such as Great British Energy, planning reforms, building more houses will play a role in increasing economic growth, and it may do to some extent. But I think the real game changer would be greater productivity growth in the private sector, which could possibly come from things like much better renewable energies, better batteries, artificial intelligence, and some magical new technology just around the corner. So that would be a catalyst to higher growth and that virtuous circle of higher growth and higher tax revenues. But equally, as well as being unlucky, the government could also have bad luck, like to some extent the last government did. You could have another cost-push inflation crisis. We could get geopolitical turmoil, a slowdown in China. And in fact, this video looks at some of the mounting problems facing the Chinese economy. It's quite interesting, so do check it out.